All right, well, we're motoring through the book of Acts on Wednesday night. So tonight we are going to begin Paul's second missionary journey in earnest. So we're going to be in Acts chapter 15. So take a minute to find that. So I told you that as we work through the book of Acts, I would periodically kind of give you a time stamp of this is where we are in history, so you could kind of, because it's easy to get lost in the Acts of, okay, was this 10 years after the resurrection or was this 50 years after the resurrection? And it's easy to run together. And also, someone, I think it was actually Danny Enlow, asked, would it be possible to maybe, kind of tell where the different books of Paul were written as we work through? So I'm going to make an attempt to do that tonight. I'm going to give you kind of where we are in history and what's going on at that time. So as we start Paul's second missionary journey, we're going to date that around AD 50 to 52. And that's about as precise as we can get with any sort of accuracy, but somewhere around AD 50 to 52. So if you, depending on when you date the resurrection, we're somewhere 20 to 25 years after the resurrection of Christ. So R plus 20 to 25. Somewhere in there. It is a good possibility that by this time the first book of the New Testament was written. And it all hinges on when you date the writing of the book of Galatians. There's two theories to that, really. And it hinges on who the Galatians are that's being written to. There's a North Galatian theory and there's a South Galatian theory that I'm not going to get into tonight. But it also kind of dictates whether you date it with an early date or a late date. And if you date it with an early date, which I don't know that I favor one over the other. My New Testament professor favored the early date. So I guess if I have to favor one, I favor the early date just because he was my teacher, and you tend to believe what you're taught. So I tend to lean that way, but I don't know that it was one over the other. But if you take an early date for Paul writing the book of Galatians, he would have written that sometime. If you look at the end of chapter 14, and Paul gets back to Antioch, and it says in verse 28, they, being Paul and Barnabas, stayed there in Antioch a long time with the disciples. So if you favor an early date for Galatians, then Paul would have written the book of Galatians sometime during that lengthy stay. And then you've got the Jerusalem Council, which deals with some of the same issues that Paul addresses in the book of Galatians, which kind of makes sense. So sometime in there. So, if you favor an early date for the book of Galatians, Paul writes Galatians AD 49 or 50, which would make it the first book of the New Testament written, probably. Because Mark probably had, the other possible option would be Mark's gospel, and he probably hadn't had time to compile his gospel yet because he just got off of the mission trip with Paul and Barnabas. So somewhere in there, 49, 50, Galatians written. If you take an early date, then Paul goes to the Jerusalem Council, and then he's going to embark on his second missionary journey AD 50 to 52. Clear as mud, right? Okay. So we're going to pick up in verse 36. Now remember, he's back from the Jerusalem council. He's back in Antioch now. Verse 36. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas was determined to take with them John called Mark, but Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another, and so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas. Remember, Silas was one of the ones that came back from the Jerusalem council with him, and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. I gave you a couple of extra handouts tonight. One is a map of Paul's second missionary journey. You'll want to make sure you have that handy as we go through this. And then the other is approximate distances for each of these places. So I think you'll find both of those helpful. So after they get back from the Jerusalem council, they're in Antioch. They're ministering in Antioch. And Paul and Barnabas say, let's go back and check on the churches that we founded, the churches that we ministered to on our first missionary journey. Let's just go back and see how everybody's doing. So they're doing follow-up, if you will. And there's a dissension, a disagreement that takes place over whether or not to take John Mark. Now, John Mark was a traveling companion on the first missionary journey, but he bails out part of the way through. And so Barnabas says, hey, that's a great idea. Let's go and let's take John Mark with us. And Paul says, I'm not taking him. You know, he bailed out on us. And you know, he went AWOL, and I'm not taking him back. We can't count on him. So why was Paul not willing to take him? Why did he not want to give Mark a second chance here? Yeah, I mean, perhaps he thought this is a tough situation. You know, we know what it's like, and I got to have people that I can count on. You know, that kind of thing. So it's kind of a fool me once, shame on you; fool me twice, shame on me kind of thing. So, you know, his idea. I mean, if you were going into if you were part of the Green Beret and you were going into a hostile combat situation, and they were going to send you, and you were the officer of the group that was going in, and your commanding officer said, "Okay, I think you ought to take this guy who, who deserted, when we were, when the shells started flying last time, he turned tail and run." What would you say? Oh yeah, let's give the kid a second chance. Or would you say, hey man, I got to have somebody that's got my back? And I think that's kind of the idea there. Now Barnabas was on the other side of things. He wanted to take John Mark. He said, let's give this guy a second chance. Now, why do you think that Barnabas would have been more willing, perhaps, to give John Mark a second chance? He was kin to him. Yeah, Barnabas means son of encouragement. So he's the guy that spoke up for Paul. Let's give this guy a chance. It's all kind of ironic that now he's having to play the same role to Paul. Let's give John Mark a second chance. And the other reason, as we said, he was John Mark's cousin. So you ever heard the saying, blood is thicker than water? The idea being, look, don't mess with my family, and it's interesting, Paul even mentions in the book of Galatians kind of this dissension that arose, of which over the whole idea of Judaism and circumcision, and that came to a head apparently at the Jerusalem Council. But it seems as though Barnabas was in on that, and kind of maybe on the other side to some extent. Paul sort of alludes to that. So maybe there's still a little bit of that going on. So now this is an interesting little case study on conflict in the church, because here you have two leaders in the early church. You have Paul and Barnabas, but you also have John Mark. Now, imagine if you're John Mark. Now, I sympathize with John Mark a little bit because, I'm kind of his namesake. Although I don't really think I was named after John Mark. My mama said I was named after the rifleman's son, Mark. So I don't know. But anyhow, I've always kind of had a soft spot in my heart for Mark because I carry his name. Imagine you get on this trip and for whatever reason you can't finish. I don't know. Maybe you're sick, maybe you're scared, maybe you're tired, maybe you're homesick. We're not really given the reason. Just you had to quit. And now, probably the greatest missionary and theologian of the day doesn't feel you can be counted on to go on the next trip. And this incident becomes the wedge that breaks up the first missionary team in the history of the church. You're responsible for that. Can you imagine the weight on Mark's shoulders? And imagine how easy it would have been for John Mark to just quit and say, God, I've failed God, I've failed Paul, I can't do anything right. I'm just going to quit. God can't use me anymore. Was that true of John Mark? No. If John Mark had have quit, we would never have had Mark's gospel, which most scholars believe was the first gospel written. And most scholars also believe that both Matthew and Luke used the Gospel of Mark as a source document for writing their gospel. So if John Mark had have quit right then, you really take away. I'm exaggerating a little bit to make a point, but you really take away 3 of the 4 Gospels that we have in our New Testament if John Mark drags up and quits just because he failed one time. Now, what would really be tragic to me is if Paul and John Mark never reconciled. They never worked it out. But was that the case? Doesn't seem like it. It seems as though John Mark and Paul reconciled, and Paul considered him a fellow worker and a friend. If you look at, let me just show you a few scriptures. For instance, Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. Paul is wrapping up his letter to Colossians, and he's listing the people that are with him. He says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, that's John Mark, about whom you received instruction. If he comes to you, welcome him. So we learn a couple of things there. A, John Mark is back to working with Paul here, and Paul thinks enough of him that he says to the Colossian church, if he comes to you, you welcome him, you greet him, you treat him as a brother. In Philemon chapter, there's only one chapter in Philemon, but in Philemon verse 24, Paul makes reference to the people that are with him as he writes, and he says, he says in 23, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ greet you, as do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, Luke, my fellow laborers. And then probably the most clear example that things that Paul had, all was forgiven in 2 Timothy. As Paul is sitting in a Roman prison, the last letter he wrote before he died, he says to them to Timothy in verse 11, he says, "Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for the ministry." In other words, I want, and it's he says, he goes on to say, in 13, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, and the books, especially the parchments. So basically, Paul is sitting in a Roman prison, awaiting to die. He said, "I've fought the good fight, and I'm already being offered as a drink offering, and my time of my departure is at hand." Paul said, I'm sitting in prison, I'm about to die. I want you to bring me 3 things, Timothy. I want you to bring me my coat. It's cold in this old Roman prison. I want you to bring me my Bible. That's what the parchments, it wasn't compiled as a Bible, but bring me my copy of the Scriptures. And the third thing is, I want you to bring me John Mark, because he's profitable to me. So, things between them seems to have been made amends. There's some lessons that I take from this. First of all, if you're John Mark, it's not what man says about you that counts. It's what God says about you, even if that man saying it is the Apostle Paul. Well, think about that. We get discouraged because people, put us down or think us not worthy for this or that. What man says about you isn't what matters. What God says about you matters. Even if the someone saying it is the Apostle Paul. I see this lesson here. No one is so high and mighty that they can write someone off as unprofitable. Even the Apostle Paul. He has to come back and really kind of eat a little bit of crow and say, "Hey, he's profitable to me. John Mark is valuable to me. Bring him to me." There's lessons for us in this. Sometimes we have to grow up a little bit. I look at John Mark on the first missionary journey, and I think he probably had some growing up to do. He had some maturing to do. But then I also see here that sometimes, we need to swallow our pride and give people a second chance. So there's lessons here for all of us, whether you're the Paul or the John Mark in this. And at times I've probably played the role of both. There have been times that I've failed and I've needed people to give me a second chance. And there have been times that people have let me down, and I'm like, I ain't giving them another chance to mess me around. And I was, I needed to grow in both counts. I needed to, when I failed, I needed to grow and mature and grow up a little bit. But then also I needed to grow up a little bit when I wasn't willing to give other people a second chance. So that road runs both ways there. How do you see God at work in this situation? Exactly. So Barnabas is going to get John Mark, and he's going to sail to Cyprus. All right. Paul is going to team up with Silas, and he's going to go the opposite direction. So now we have 2 missionary teams covering twice the land. They're kind of, enveloping the territory, as opposed to just one. So I think of Romans 8:28. God causes all things to work together for good to those that love Him and are called according to His purpose. Dissension is not God's will. Dissension is never God's will. But we serve a God that's big enough to take even our failures and immaturities and work them to His good. And I think that's what we see at work here. Questions on... Yes, ma'am. Sorry, Luke doesn't give a point-by-point description of Paul's missionary journeys. Instead, he merely hits the high points. So, he's not going to tell us every place they went and every sermon they preached, but he's just going to hit the high points. So, keeping that in mind. All right, let's look on then to verse 1 of chapter 16. And get your little map out. Get your map out and follow along as I read this, or as we read this together. We're starting in Antioch of Syria. You see that on your map there, and follow along there. Then he came to Derbe and Lystra, and you see Derbe and Lystra there. He's tracking out. Now this is the same place. These are towns that he went to on his first missionary journey. So there's a church established. There are believers established there. There's a witness established there. This is follow-up work at this point, all right? He comes to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy. That's going to be significant. Timothy's going to become one of his traveling companions, and he would refer to him as his son in the faith. So this is a significant event. He meets Timothy in Derbe and Lystra in that area. So, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. This is significant. So we've got a Jewish mom, but we've got a Greek father. And that meant to, as far as religious terms, pagan. Some Jewish background, but also some pagan background. Verse 2, he was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. So the believers there, he has made an impression on them. Paul wanted to have him go with him as a traveling companion, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. And as they went through the cities, they delivered to them the decrees to keep, which were determined by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem. Remember the Jerusalem council? They came out and they wrote this letter, and they basically said, you don't have to keep the Jewish law, but keep these 4 things. You remember what the 4 things were? No, don't eat blood. Don't eat anything strangled. No sexual immorality, and food offered to idols. So they're delivering these decrees. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily. Okay, let's talk. Main thing I wanted to point out on that was that in the Jerusalem Council, as well as in the book of Galatians, Paul vehemently defends the idea that you don't have to be circumcised. The Gentiles do not have to be circumcised and become Jews in order to become Christians. Now, he's got Timothy. He's wanting to take him with him as a traveling companion. And the first thing he does is say, okay, Timothy, well, first thing we need to do is get you circumcised. Why? Is that, do you see that as Paul contradicting himself? And if not, then what's going on here? He was half Jew. That's right. Yes, sir. Right. Right. So, right. His mother was Jewish. That's right. So, well, so here's what you got. You got basically a Gentile dad, a Jewish mom, and this fact has already been established that he doesn't have to be circumcised in order to be saved. That was hammered out at the Jerusalem Council. You don't have to do that. He doesn't have to follow the Jewish law to be saved. That's been hammered out. So the idea of him being circumcised has to do with the fact that you're right, he is half Jewish. And so as not to offend the Jews, and that's what it says, so as not to offend the Jews. They want to know, okay, Paul, why are you trying to keep Jews from being circumcised? I mean, that would be the question. And you're right, you said it. Don't give them any more ammunition to find fault with Paul. Secondly, where he's wanting to take Timothy, this is a missionary strategy. He's taking them. They're going when they get to a town. What's the first thing they do? Where's the first place they generally go? Synagogue. Who's in the synagogue? Jews. Okay. If they go to Jerusalem to worship, where are they probably going to worship? The temple, synagogue or temple. So their strategy was always to start with the Jews and then turn to the Gentiles. So if I'm going to try to reach a group of people, is it the best strategy to go out and offend those people before I even get a chance to talk to them about Jesus? Probably not the best strategy. You know, if you're going to, to try to reach a group of people, if you're going out and try to reach, let's just do. If you're let me use me so as not to offend any group. You know, if you're going to Texas, God calls you to Texas, and and you're going to try to reach Texans. If you're from New York City, good luck to you, by the way. But it's probably not the best idea to wear a big 10-gallon hat and boots that come up to your thighs and walk around with a dinner plate belt buckle and walk around and say, "Well, howdy, y'all. I know y'all are too stupid to understand anything about the gospel. I'm going to tell you about Jesus." That's probably not the best strategy you want to do. So that's the idea. That's the idea here, is that we don't want to offend these people before we even get a chance to talk to them. So let's jump through the hoops. That's basically exactly right. Yeah. Let's not aggravate these people before we even get a chance to tell them about Jesus. So that's the idea. It has nothing to do with being saved. It has to do with trying to be able to reach people. And Paul elsewhere would say, "I've become all things to all people," to try to reach them for Christ. And I think there's a lesson to be learned in that. Try to appeal to people and not offend people, so that you can have the opportunity to tell them about Jesus. Yeah. Right. Right. Exactly. No. No. You're right. You, yeah. Well, you make a big point. Well, and yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah. 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 That's true. That's true. And like I said, I mean, if it very well could be, if you're coming into if you're not from there and you're coming into a synagogue to worship, maybe one of the first questions that gets asked is, "Are you Jewish? Are you completely Jewish?" And so, I'm trying to pick my words carefully here. I don't know, but anyway, I mean, so maybe that it all ties into this idea of let's not offend them. Let's have an opportunity to witness. So they're trekking across the tableland of Galatia here. Now, here's an interesting side note. Doesn't have anything to do with the text, but it's an interesting side note about Galatia. Galatia is this area of Galatia is on tableland, and it's a breeding ground for mosquitoes. So mosquitoes are terrible in that area. What do mosquitoes often carry? Malaria. So some have proposed a possibility, a theory that Paul, when he makes reference to his thorn in the flesh, he says, I received from Satan a thorn in the flesh, or received from the Lord a thorn in the flesh, messenger of Satan to buffet me. And I asked the Lord 3 times to take it away, and he said, my grace is sufficient for you. I'm not removing the thorn in the flesh. You remember that story. Some have proposed that perhaps that was malaria that he had contracted while trekking through Galatia. Now, nobody knows. I've also heard theories that it was his eyesight, because in some of his letters he says, you see what large letters I'm writing with. So perhaps it was his eyesight. I don't know. I heard one preacher say one time it was probably his wife, but I don't think that's right. I don't think that's an accurate thing. So anyway, it's just kind of an interesting little thing that this area, it does tell us, whether he caught malaria or not, it does tell us that this area was dangerous. It tells us that it was not a pleasant thing. You enjoy going hiking where the mosquitoes are large enough to carry off a small child? I mean, it's not fun. This wasn't a fun trip. This was no vacation he was on. This was a rough go of things. Tableland, very flat, like as opposed to Texas Panhandle, yeah, as opposed to mountains or valleys, a very flat. We might call it a plateau kind of thing. That idea. So, all right, let's look on then to verse 6. One of the most significant parts of Acts, in my opinion. Chapter 16, verse 6. Now, when they had gone through Phrygia, now take out your little map. Let's follow Paul on his adventure here. He's going through Phrygia and the region of Galatia. They were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia. And that's not Asia as in Japan and China. That's Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. So their idea was that they would trek on across Asia Minor here and preach in the towns along the way. But the Holy Spirit is not going to let them do that. So what are they going to do? Verse 7. After they had come to Mysia, they tried to go to Bithynia, but the Spirit did not permit them. So Mysia is over here, west of Phrygia. Bithynia, you can look on your map, is more northeast. So it seems as though they start to go one way. The Holy Spirit forbids them, and so they kind of turn. And think, okay, we'll turn and we'll go a different direction. Holy Spirit isn't going to let them go there either. So, verse 7, so passing by Mysia, they came to Troas. So now we don't know where God wants us to go. We're just going in the last direction we knew where we were supposed to go. They're tracking out across Mysia, and they get to Troas, which is a port city. It's a port town. They've gone as far as they could go. Now we're at the ocean. Now we're at the Aegean Sea. What do we do? God, where are we going to go? I mean, God, you've led me to the end of the path. Where are we going now? And that's when God speaks in the form of vision. Verse 9, a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia stood and pleaded with him, saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. And after he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel to them. So he gets a vision. He follows as far as he can. He runs out a path. He's like, God, as far as I can go. You're going to have to tell me where we're going here. And he gets a vision from the Lord. Man from Macedonia, come over to Macedonia and help us. And so they get on a ship. They head over to Macedonia. And most scholars would say, and tradition holds, that this was the first, when they reached Macedonia and began to preach the gospel, this was the first gospel witness on European soil. Now that is hugely significant for us because most everyone in here probably can trace their ancestry, at least in part, to European descent. So our people heard the gospel because Paul was obedient to a vision and a direction from the Lord and went not to Asia Minor, not this time. He's been to Asia Minor, he'll be again. But this time he's going to Europe. This time he's going to what would be modern day Greece. And because of that, our ancestors are going to get to hear the gospel for the first time. So that's hugely significant. So let's talk just a second about that. Paul wanted to go to Asia Minor. This was commendable. He wanted to preach the gospel to these people. They needed to hear, he thought. But God had other plans. Instead, God is sending him to some place he never thought of. Modern day Greece, Europe. What conclusions can we draw about serving the Lord from this? Sure. I think, to me, it says God has a definite plan for each of us, a definite direction. I was in a Sunday school class one time. I was college age. And I was in this Sunday school class, and this guy, he gets up and he draws a circle, on the big circle on the board, and a dot. And he points to the dot and he says, some people believe God's will is like this dot, one specific point. But he said, really, God's will is like this circle, that this is all God's permissive will. And as long as you're in this, you're okay. Well, I didn't say, I'm just a college kid. I'm not going to correct the teacher who was twice my age and seemed like a young jerk, But I disagree with him. I believe that God has a specific will for each of us. I believe there is a specific place you're supposed to go to school. I believe there's a specific job God has for you. I believe God had a specific woman He wanted me to marry. I believe that God specifically wanted me to come to Claremore, Oklahoma. I remember when I called my mom. Of course, my mom's in a nursing home. And I have to tell her, okay, I'm moving from the panhandle of Texas to Claremore, Oklahoma. I could have said, I'm moving to Norway. It wouldn't. In my mom's mind, if you're not in Texas, like you're at the ends of the earth, kind of thing. My mom was over 40 before she ever left the state of Texas. And even though I tried to explain to her, it's the same. It's 5 hours from Wellington to Cleburne, and it's 5 hours from Claremore to Cleburne. It's the same distance. I'm just in a different state. To her, it wasn't that way. I was going off, to the ends of the earth. And she said that, and I'm not trying to put my mom down. I love my mom, but she said, "Well, I don't know why you have to go all the way to Oklahoma. There's good people right here in Cleburne that you can preach to." That's wrong in so many levels. What I wanted to say was, God, I'm not called to go reach good people. I'm called to go preach, to the lost. And I'm not called to preach to good people in Cleburne. I'm called to preach to bad people in Claremore, Oklahoma. No, I'm just messing with y'all. But but the point, I'm that hanging curveball. I just had to take a swing at it. But but you understand my point. God wasn't calling me to preach in Cleburne. He was calling me to preach in Claremore, Oklahoma. And if I'd have gone anywhere else, if I'd have went back to Waxahachie, Texas, and preached, at you know, and started a mega church there, and wowed the masses, I would not have been in God's will, because God had a specific place for me to be, and here I am. And God had a specific place for Paul to be, and it was Macedonia. So don't sell yourself out on this idea that, well, as long as I'm somewhere in the circle, then that's okay. Hold out for the dot. God has a specific point. Don't settle for the circle. Hold out for the dot. Hey, that'd be a good sermon. I might preach that one day. That's pretty good. So he's going to Macedonia. I've got a couple. Now, the cool part about the second missionary journey is that much of where Paul went on his second missionary journey is where we went on our trip we just got back from. So I'm going to be able to intersperse a few pictures along the way. I'll try not to wear you out with pictures, but here's a couple of them. This is the mountains of Macedonia. I had no idea, to be honest with you, until I saw it. I didn't know Macedonia was a mountainous place, but it is. I mean, you see. So how easy do you think travel would have been going over this kind of terrain? It would not have been an easy journey on foot, for sure, especially if you're scratching mosquito bites because you just got out of Galatia. So it wouldn't have been an easy journey. So throw the next slide up there. This is the port at Neapolis, modern day Kavala, I think. Is that right? So Paul would have said that you're looking out at the Aegean Sea. Paul would have sailed across the Aegean Sea from Troas, which you can't really see, but he would have sailed in. He would have sailed into that harbor right there, that very one. He and his traveling companions would have gotten out of their boat right there, and they would have started walking up down the Ignatian Way, which you can't see. I've got better pictures of it that I'll throw up probably next time. But they would have walked down the Ignatian Way into Philippi and preached the gospel, and the first Europeans would have gotten saved. First European convert, most people believe, was Lydia. And so that's where it all began, right there. So, questions on Acts chapter 15 and 16 up to where we've covered now? I have a brief video from our friend Dave Stott that will kind of summarize what we were able to talk about tonight.